you turn the volume off, because otherwise you'll hear it through your own microphone, when it starts going live here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just let us know when you click live.
Yeah, we
Yeah.
are going live. It should pop up any moment now.
Sounds good.
And for some reason, YouTube is always the last to go. And I'm pretty sure just about every one of these podcasts starts with me mumbling something about YouTube. Oh, it looks like we are live. Hey, everyone. We are live. Let me just hit this intro graphic and we'll get right to it. So, hey, everyone. I have a fantastic pleasure today of speaking with two people from the community who it's a little bit different because usually we have some sort of a Dash Core group or other kind of company or something like that. But this time we have a much more interesting angle that we're taking. So for everyone who doesn't know them, here's Hilawe and here's Rion, two active members of the community who've been around basically as far as I've known for, many, many years. And basically what we're talking about today is governance and economic incentives. So first, how are you going, guys?
All right.
Going well.
Yeah.
Going well.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I'm just making sure everything's set up. Should be on Facebook, Twitter, and of course YouTube, which is the big one where everyone is. So we're just trying to do relatively freeform discussion. So as such, if you guys are watching, feel free to just jump on in to the live chat and just say whatever you want. And within reason, come on, within reason. But you say whatever you want and contribute to the discussion. And I will point out now that we have a crypto live chat here, which is this button down right here, that if you go to cointr.ee/thedesertlinks, you can just leave a donation with your message, and that just shows right up here. And then, after I make sure you're not saying like mean words or whatever, then I just expand it out, and then there you go. So now we've covered all the bases. To introduce the topic, and this is why we need to have as much media as possible on Dash, because it's a giant, maybe not by some other communities' perspectives, but by, let's just say, like a small company perspective or whatever, it's a giant ecosystem of people all around the world who have no central point of all communicating with each other. And there's been quite a few issues that have come up over the years that have ended up in votes, governance votes, of how do we move forward as a community? What needs to be changed with Dash? What doesn't need to be changed? And a lot of times where this happens is on a place like Dash Central, which is like a voting portal. But not only there, sometimes people don't do that. They just vote, from a different tool. They don't even see the discussions. They go to social media, they do whatever else. And so with each place a discussion happens, it crops up a different spot, and it just makes the chances it gets propagated to the rest of the network, like, a transaction amongst nodes, lower and lower. So I'm trying to get this thing kind of out there. So for those who weren't aware, back in December, Ryan Taylor, the CEO of Dash Core Group, came up with a presentation where he basically just said, hey, Dash's price has not been doing as well as otherwise could have been. I think I have some theories that it might not just be bear market or other things. There might be something in the very tokenomics of Dash that's not doing that well. And so he kind of proposed a discussion, and the discussion ended up over, long time in turning into a block reward reallocation from the non-treasury point of Dash's treasury, the non-treasury point of the block reward, from being 50-50 miners masternodes to being 40-60 miners masternodes. And that change got implemented in version 16, 0.16, which is live now, and the miners are, hopefully in the process of implementing it. I've seen the adoption rate going up a little bit, still a long ways to go, but barring a catastrophe, it's probably going to happen. But in this whole thing, there was another thing that came up, which is, while we're at it, we might as well modify the treasury. right now 10% of the new coins created can go to treasury proposals, like the fund development, things like that. If they aren't created, if they don't get spent, they aren't created. And so what, for anyone with a kind of a basic grasp of economics would kind of get out of this, although there's quite a few that sadly don't, is that it makes your coins more scarce and therefore more valuable. And so it's not free money to spend. Every bit of money you create to spend on treasury proposals is inflation and makes everyone's holdings less valuable. And so basically Ryan Taylor said, hey, in a future thing, let's talk about making it so that the coins are created regardless, but they just go to miners and masternodes. And therefore you actually see the effects of this. And also you propose, hey, what about a 20% treasury cap instead of a 10%? So there's more flexibility in the up and down. People will tend to not spend the whole treasury because of this. And so that's kind of where we're at now. But the discussion, as it turns out, doesn't end right there. There's been a lot of discussion about different incentive structures and how, basic and who gets to decide what gets spent, what doesn't spend, all that kind of stuff. So that's kind of where we're at today. This is a discussion on the effects of governance, the effects on governance of economic incentives. So first, I think it's a good idea to just mention the entire reason for making the costs of proposals more visible is to affect masternode behavior. So first, do you guys think that this is actually going to, that let's just say, if the new coins created would go that aren't created or aren't spent on proposals get evenly split or relatively evenly split amongst miners and masternodes, do you think that will have an impact in voting behavior?
I guess I could take a stab at that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, first of all, we haven't really seen any proposals yet. So we're talking about future changes that may be proposed in the future, most likely will be. And we know generally what those kind of proposals might look like, or what that proposal might look like, because we have some polling that Ryan Taylor did in the Discord channels and elsewhere. And also he brought some of these changes up in past presentations as well. So the idea is that instead of how it works right now, where masternodes are able to vote for certain proposals to get funded, but that funding doesn't come from their own pockets, doesn't come from anywhere, it just gets created. So it essentially comes from everybody. And so that's how the system works right now. There's no direct cost that a masternode owner experiences when he decides to fund a proposal. The theory is that if we fund things that aren't valuable, that those coins that get created might find their way to exchanges and being sold for USD to push it, that would push down the price. And if the value of the proposal, what they're proposing to create doesn't compensate for that and in increased demand for the coin, then that's a net negative. So I guess the idea of what's being proposed, or what will be proposed, is to make a tangible direct cost to funding proposals, so that there's some kind of more judicious evaluation happening. We don't just throw money anywhere. We actually feel the pain of funding stuff more directly and more immediately, rather than just some potential inflation that might cause downward pressure in price.
Yeah, and I could definitely attest to that from my own perspectives, right? Again, opinions. My opinion is there's been quite a few. First, there have been bad proposals. Let's just be honest about that. But there have been quite a lot of good proposals by great teams providing a lot of hard work and a lot of impact and things like that, that nonetheless, I probably think in retrospect should not have been funded by the Dash Treasury because they didn't actually provide the necessary value, but because they said, hey, we're going to create a great service, a great product, a great whatever, and we're going to deliver on that, and you trust us to. And then Masters, all right, let's just give it a shot. But those kinds of things, like, I would not fund with my own hard-earned money. And I think a lot of people did not understand that they were funding it with their own hard-earned money. And I think there's been a little bit of a conscious shift towards understanding that, but it was only because a lot of people started to say, hey, you realize that when we're not creating coins, we're better off, right? But there's that we're talking about potentially doing an actual visual signal where you get to see the money you saved pop into your own wallets.
Yes. So one last thing. I mean, the other issue was overspending was an issue during the bull run. So you had a lot of sponsorships that were hundreds of thousands of dollars worth or millions in some case. And so a lot of arguments recently is, hey, we're only spending 8 to 9% of the current 10%. But that's just because, market conditions have changed, but it doesn't mean that when there's a bull run again, it won't happen again. I think it would. Yeah. So part of the motivation is to actually make it so when there is a bull run that masternodes are incentivized to either keep their money or not necessarily go to exchanges, maybe spend it on airline tickets or buying things from Amazon and things like that. And then the other part is reducing the other motivation that Rion Taylor talked about, is reducing the circulation supply of non-masternode funds. So that is actually to reduce the circulation of non-masternode Dash. So to incentivize holding.
Yeah. So, I mean, altogether, some of these seem like weird little tinkers as far as like, oh, we're just going to like adjust a couple things here and there. But so the smallest little bit of tinkering or smallest little change in terms of economic incentives can make something worthwhile or not worthwhile. And for people who aren't, that well versed, there's something called the Socialist calculation problem, where if you don't have prices, you don't have like a pricing system, you can't really plan for something to be efficiently produced. And while that's not exactly the case with the Dash Treasury of today, because there are prices and stuff like that, you do see what you can afford and what you can't afford. You don't see how much that's costing you. There's this lack of a connection between your own personal investment and your own personal return on that investment. And it's kind of interesting thing because, so I've been, in the crypto space for a while. I've been heavily involved with the Dash community for many years. More recently, I've poked my head around a little bit and like looked around at other stuff, what's going on in other projects. And I do think that Dash has solved a lot of problems that most other projects are like nowhere near solving. However, I have noticed that there has been a kind of a community atrophy aspect with Dash, where, and this is my personal opinion, right? I've seen a lot of services in Dash have to go through the treasury or they don't get done. Whereas you have something like, say, a Bitcoin Cash where people are doing flip starters and things like that all the time, and you're getting things built that, a lot of times are the same things that are getting built on Dash, but they're being built by voluntary donations. And it kind of, it's a little mind-blowing, but it's because I do believe there might be some sort of a talent drain happening because of, like, you have to go through the official channels or it doesn't get done. Whereas, with other projects, there might be a more spontaneous kind of thing where people are saying, hey, I'll just do whatever. And let me just conclude this bit of my personal opinion. I used to think that everything could be done through the treasury, it should be done through the treasury. Now I think as few things as possible should probably be done through the treasury, because personal opinion, right? I would love to hear what you guys think next, but because I think that when you do something through the treasury, you summon the entire network and ask everyone who has a stake, ask them all for their input, and before deciding to move on. And that's a for something like a monumental change, that's very important. for something that's not a monumental change. Like, hey, what do you think about, should we slap this sticker on the side of a bus and do this? Or how about let's advertise some airline stuff? I don't think that everyone needs to necessarily be involved with that decision, or everyone needs to be paying with that. So I don't know what you guys think.
Well, it's anybody's guess how it's going to go from here, but it is a bit of a gamble that we've taken with Dash, where we've introduced this proposal system, this so-called treasury, where it's possible now to get funding from the protocol itself, where that's not possible with something like Bitcoin Cash or Bitcoin or most other coins. In fact, there are very few coins that do this kind of funding system. And it's a gamble because we don't know how it's going to work out, because the benefit is that you can essentially, like, it's like a supercharged crowdfund Kickstarter kind of thing, where masternode owners have the ability to create coins out of nothing. It's a lot like the government, how say like the Federal Reserve can print money out of nowhere and fund a bunch of stuff. Now, there's a fundamental difference with cryptocurrencies like Dash and other cryptocurrencies that have treasuries, because we're working within a completely voluntary system. So it's fundamentally different than something like the Federal Reserve in that sense. But it's very similar in the sense that we're able to create funds to throw at projects. And the only thing that matters is what the quality of those projects are. So with the government, when there's no cost to creating the funds, no direct, immediate personal cost to creating those funds, that usually ends up in funding projects that really have no value. No cost, no value. So the idea is that we need to fix that so that there is a cost to funding proposals, that you're paying something personally when you're funding a project. So it's moving closer to the Kickstarter kind of approach, where you're actually spending some of your own money. And as far as what portion of economic activity in Dash happens within the treasury, super block, proposal system, whatever you want to call it, versus outside of that in private enterprise, that's the tricky part, because now the private sector, I mean, I hate to call it private versus public sector, because like I've said,
they're good analogies, though,
it's not the same, because we're still, even with the treasury system, that's a completely voluntary. I consider that still the private sector. It's at least the free market sector. But regardless, you can do projects outside of proposal system or treasury funding. And you need to demonstrate that that project's going to have value in a big way, because the people funding you are doing it out of their own pockets, versus the proposal system, where it's essentially subsidized. It's essentially 100% subsidized. Every single masternode owner who's voting on a given project is voting with 100% other people's money as the current system stands.
Yeah, at least that's the way they perceive it.
It's very hard then for some group outside of that system to compete, because how do you compete with a fully subsidized system?
Yeah, and that's a great.
You probably experienced that yourself. Like, how hard has it been to ask for donations or ask for funding, where people have to actually send you their own money? It's probably a lot harder because you're competing with this proposal system.
Yeah, I do definitely agree with that. It's a different sort of it's harder and easier in completely different ways. So, first off, it's very hard, I think, to get the average Dash holder to part with their money, to like donate to things, not because they're stingy, not because they don't believe in investing in the infrastructure or the community or whatever else. It's because they almost seem like it's a waste. It's like you go to a coffee shop, you pay for a latte, but you already have a punch card filled out with a free latte coupon. It's like, why would you spend your money when you got the freebie? Like, that just makes no sense. And so that's what people, I think, get to thinking of when they're funding proposals. It's like, I would donate for, let's just say, I would donate for Dash Electrum, so that you have the valuable backend infrastructure and do other things like that. I would donate to keep that going, but I would never donate because it's the treasury's there. Like, there's free
Right.
money on the table to pay for that. It would be a waste, even though I am paying either way, and probably the same
Right.
amount either way. And as you mentioned about like, what's the difference between the fiat? I mean, what's the difference between the treasury world and the non-treasury world? It's definitely a lot harder to get individuals to, pay for something like that on an individual basis. At the same time, it's a much more easy, streamlined process, because all you have to do is
Convince one or two people.
or convince a few people or whatever, and basically the no votes don't matter. The no votes are just
That's right.
don't give you money. The yes votes give you money, and then that's it if you have enough. But then there's that, when you're doing something collectively as a group of individuals, right? Then you need some sort of a consensus. And so, especially something as like a YouTube show or podcast or whatever, like, I don't think that needs to have consensus. It just, people like it. It's like a product. People like it. They pay for it. Whatever. They don't like it. They don't watch it. But then we were talking about like, we'll just implement a block reward reallocation. If you like it, you do. If you don't, you don't. Like, no, you need the whole community together on that, which is why it's kind of important to have a collective kind of element, or like an HOA or something, like the whole the whole apartment complex or whatever has to be on like this. They have to. You need to come together on that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and it's an effective way to fund a project that benefits everybody, when everybody can just chip in $1 or something like that. Mm-hmm. So if you work the numbers with the proposal system right now, there's about 5,000 Dash, plus or minus a little bit more than that, per month to divvy out, that's available to spend or to create, I should say. There are also about 5,000 masternodes currently. So if you work that out, it's about 1 Dash per masternode, that if masternodes were covering the entire expense of the proposal system, it would amount to about 1 Dash per masternode. So one way to think of that is, think about all the value that the proposal system can create in a month. Think about all the proposals that maybe happened last month or in a good month. Would you personally, if you were a masternode owner, would you personally be willing to pay 1 Dash to fund all of those things? Is the value that they're proposing worth 1 Dash to you? Mm-hmm. And that's kind of the question that you could ask yourself. And I think a lot of people would say, yeah, like even funding DCG alone is worth 1 Dash to me, because if I'm a masternode owner, I have 1,000 Dash sitting in my savings. If the price of Dash, if whatever DCG is doing is eventually going to push the price of Dash up by $1, I've just made $1,000. So exactly. That way more than compensates for the 1 Dash that I gave up, which would be worth about $70 today.
Yeah. But now what you do is, by doing that, you introduce a calculation that didn't happen before. Before, people were like, oh, does this seem like it's good for Dash? Does this seem like these people are not charging a lot of money and they're doing a thing that we all love? And that's a great base calculation, but you don't just do that that's not how you run a business, right? Because businesses go broke if they do things the wrong way. They do things that way, just like, oh yeah, like this vendor seems nice. I like the way, I like the supplier. I like the prices he charges for this. I'll do that. It's like, no, you have to calculate, first off, can you afford it? Because you can't always afford it. And then you have to calculate, will taking this action bring in enough revenue to, at the very least, compensate for what I spent on it? And then you have to go and start scribbling down your piece of paper, go in your Excel and just do some calculations and figure out if it actually works, if it's efficient. And if it's not efficient, then it's not efficient. And I saw this a lot of times. You have a lot of proposals that were favorites because they're hardworking people. They're great people that did a good job. They worked hard, and people are like, oh, but we got to fund them. We love what they do. And there's this sort of emotional problem with not funding them anymore, because it's like, but they're good people, we like them. And while that's true, if you can't afford it, there's no ROI. That's a completely different argument. At that point, just like, you know what, love the work you guys are doing, it just doesn't make sense business wise right now, bye. And it's not like a big, emotional defunding. You want to chime in there, Hill?
Yeah, I mean, it's a grant system. Really, that's how it works. There's no strings attached, no equity, no people bring up the diff, but you can't do that with every project. You have to be extremely selective with that. So that doesn't usually apply in terms of equity. So really, I think if we have more judicious spending, because people feel the pain, feel the burn the next month. So I speculate there'll be lower tendency for MNOs to look for the hit it out of the park proposals, where they're just like totally throwing a bunch of dash to see if something works. Instead, I think the better model is to build up a project with trust. You start really small. The team employs certain tactics, see if it works, and then they come back with a slightly higher ask.
Yeah.
And I think that's a more organic way of growing. I think that will actually push that ahead. And we're still even with let's say masternodes, pay for the cost of it and all that. We're still a highly socialized kind of a pulled funding system.
A social funding system.
Yeah, I mean, if you're one masternode owner out of, Ryan Gold says this all the time. It's like, if you're just one out of 5,000, you're what, 0.02% or something. So you're just trying to improve the odds of having a more crowdfunding type incentive. While being in a socialized type system.
It's interesting to see, because when we have this one treasury that people just take for granted, no pun intended, granted, but when they have this like fixed amount of money that just it's up for grabs, it kind of like eliminates a lot of other things by making there's no comparison with a donation based system, because this is free money, this is not, like there's no competition. But once it's kind of realigned that it was never free money to begin with, and now you definitely know it's not free money, now it's like head to head with other systems, and then you can start to see people branch out into other models that don't fit with the treasury thing. So for example, there are a lot of projects, I have a feeling, that will never be funded by consensus. Like, just you won't get most masternodes to just agree that we all need to pay for this. There'll be a minority funding kind of a thing. And those things those just don't pass. As proposals, they don't pass. As in a system where people recognize that proposals aren't magic free money anymore, then those proposals would pass by a smaller group. So let's just say a third of masters loves the idea, but the rest just don't. Then they're like, well, okay, well, you're still around. Like, we still want to pay for this. We still want this to happen. But then they might start haggling, saying, yeah, no, you know what? Can you get it done for like 2/3 the cost? Because now we're paying like so much more individually for that. And you end up having those kinds of things that don't fit into the one size fits all approach that, have stronger different fan bases. So for example, let's just talk podcast audience. If you have a giant podcast audience and you just run basic CPM ads on that, like you get a certain amount of revenue. But you can make the same amount with like a very much smaller audience that really loves what you do and is willing to pay for exclusive episodes and things like that. There's like a different funding model there. And under the current Dash system, only the first of those two possible valuable offerings has a place. But now, once you kind of even it out, now you can start seeing different funding models of things like that.
Well, the interesting thing about this whole thing is that all of these systems are kind of new ideas of how to fund projects. So you have the VC approach, where some VCs are funding a cryptocurrency, or you have a system that has a pre-mine, and the founders, mine themselves 20% of the coins for themselves, and if the coins appreciate due to great projects, then they've done a great job with funding themselves. or you have a system like ours that takes a little bit each month, or you have system proposals like Bitcoin Cash, where they're just in a month here or so, they're going to be voting with mining hash power, voting on whether they should have integrated mining infrastructure funding plan. That's another system. And all of these systems, in my mind, are free market solutions that are trying to see what sticks and trying to see what doesn't. And I think that Dash is in the front of that pack as far as having an effective model that's both fair and effective. Or considered fair. Fair is kind of in the eye of the beholder to some extent. Even the proposals that we're going to be seeing next month with Dash, a lot of them are probably going to be seen, or they might be seen by a lot of people as unfair or possibly fair, depending on what your model is of who's supposed to be in control of Dash. That's a whole other can of worms, but more of those ideas could be fleshed out later, I guess.
Well, yeah. Well, let's not go necessarily into the can itself, but on the surrounding periphery of worms, and talk about miner versus masternode, who pays for treasury type thing. So back in the beginning, right, you have Dash is 100% mined to coin, and then they introduced masternodes, and then it's like 50-50. As far as I know, and now my Dash history is not quite up to par, but I do seem to recall there was a time when it was a 50-50 split with no treasury, where they saw like a Dash foundation to figure things out, and then the treasury came later, and they had 45-45-10 split, or 50-50 of the non-treasury. And then now we're going to 60-40, and then there's the treasury. And so whenever you have like the block reward kind of change like that, the miners have always paid alongside with the masternodes the invisible tax of spending things on proposals. As in, anytime you create new Dash to fund a proposal, it makes everyone else's Dash worth slightly less. Masternodes, of course, because they have a big pot of Dash in addition to Dash income, but also miners, whatever income they have or whatever they hold on to, that also, it comes out of that as well. It comes out of every Dash holder, user, etc. And so then I've heard brought up in the community recently about, so the idea when Rion Taylor was saying, hey, let's make it so that we create those new coins. And so we actually see the cost of things, and that thing makes things much more efficient, makes things easier to estimate, kinds of things like that. It would be among the miner masternode split. So that, for example, on its own, if that were introduced before the reallocation, it would be, 50-50. The cost of every new proposal would be 50-50 miner masternode. And then under the way things have gone now, 60-40. And then that brings in a whole different can of worms, because we think about, okay, so when we vote for a treasury proposal, when we fund something out of the treasury, that is supposedly the benefit of the whole network, right? It's just this for Dash, where this is the best for Dash. We fund development, helps all of Dash, does everything. Now, masternodes, people who hold their capital in units of Dash and some, infrastructure costs, but most of the money is in Dash. They get to make 100% of the decisions on how that goes. And miners who have their capital in a different area of Dash, in a non-Dash denominated area, i.e. mining hardware, they don't get any say in that decision-making process. What they do have a say in, which as long as Dash is a proof-of-work coin, this will probably be that way, is whether or not to actually implement the changes at the end of the day, whether or not you're going to, fork the coin or whatever. Are you going to upgrade all that kind of stuff? So it's like they have last-ditch effort veto power, but they don't actually have a vote in things that affect them and come out of their pocket. And so that comes to the idea of and in prefacing this, I got to say that we're speaking conceptually, not about anything specific right now, and I don't know where I would even fall on this idea either. I think it's a very interesting thing to bring up is, what if masternodes, because they pay, what if the miners had a fixed emission rate? What if they depending on what the treasury spends, goes up and down, whatever. Miners' output is just flat. It's consistent. But then masternodes are the ones who get all the savings from not spending money or foot the entire bill for everything that comes out of the treasury. And so, first off, that does bring up a few different, it does add a few different curveballs to this whole thing. So I'll let you guys throw a couple things. And also in live chat or the super chat, if you have any opinions on this, why don't you drop them in there? I'll let one of you guys take it away for a little bit.
Sure. So I think it's, the way that I see it is that miners so there was a book that was written. I actually don't know the author right now, but it's called Voice, Exit, and Loyalty. And I've only read about the book. I haven't actually read the book, but the concept is interesting because it talks about when you are in a political system, as we all are, you have two main options of how to make your preferences known. First is your voice. You can speak your mind, you can vote, you can use those kind of methods to use your voice essentially. The other is exit. If you don't like what's happening, you can leave. And libertarians hear this all the time. If you don't like how America is,
Somalia.
move to Somalia.
Always Somalia, isn't it?
It's always the exit choice, right? As if voice doesn't matter. And voice is, the poster child of voice is democracy, right? We have the democracy. And the loyalty thing is kind of a separate issue. I don't know enough about how that's intertwined, but those are the two main ideas that you have as a citizen of an economy or of a political system, voice and exit. So the way that I see it is that masternodes have the voice in Dash, and miners have the power of exit.
Yeah.
They can say, okay, masternode owners, you've made these decisions. I don't like that. I'm moving over to this other fork. And obviously users have that as well. And masternodes, everybody has the option of exit. If something's not going the way that you think it should be going, you just sell your coins and leave.
Of course.
So the beauty of Dash is that we've emphasized the importance of voice before exit. So if you look at something like Bitcoin, they're really optimizing for exit, man. They exit every 6 to 12 months, it seems like. There's a fork, and then people they don't have the ability to exercise voice in an effective way. It's just Twitter, Reddit, Facebook squabbles, where none of that, it's just could be sock puppets everywhere, and you don't really know who is having those conversations. So with Dash, we have an effective way to show our voice, which is the governance system, the proposal system. We can put up governance decisions, and we know that those people that are exercising their voice in that system are the stakeholders. They're the real stakeholders. They're the ones that have the most to gain and the most to lose from good and bad decisions, respectively. So that's what I love about Dash. And but it's also important to know, so we've got these masternodes and miners, and to me, the lifeblood of Dash is the proposal system. That's where we fund our development team. That's where we fund all of our development teams, I should say. That's where all the growth comes from.
I would probably interject really quickly that it's probably Dash's single most defining competitive advantage. Up until very recently, there was no other serious treasury coin projects. Yeah,
that's right. But just one real quick thing. It really depends on how you see Dash. I don't see Dash as a nation or as a company or as a technology even. Dash is an economy, and an economy requires a labor force to be effective. You can look around you, and you're in an economy right now, and the how well that economy is working is how well the labor market is working. Right now in Dash, the labor market is the proposal system. So I'd like to see that expanded and made as efficient as possible, so that the most value is being extracted from that, and not in an exploitive way, but in a good way. That's where our growth comes from. So
Yeah.
go ahead, Hilawe.
No, I was just saying, like, the MNOs are masternode owners are the final decision makers, but we have the stakeholders, users, miners, partners, business partners, proposal owners too, along with the MNOs. So in any economy or even business, you don't give necessarily the workers, or if you want to call the miners the security guards, the same decision-making capabilities,
Yeah.
and management that you do. And usually it's the voting stakeholders, in our case that's MNOs or executives, who make that decision. Go ahead.
Yeah, and that's the funny thing is, I love what mainnetistic, so to speak, of ideas, as in try it out in the free market in the real world, see if it works. And like that's one reason why I've been living off of crypto with no bank account for a few years. I start talking about this stuff, and like I don't actually know if it works unless I need a guinea pig, and who's the only guinea pig I can consent for is myself. So when we're talking about, it's funny because when we're talking about crypto stuff, you get a very different perspective talking with hardcore Bitcoiners, because there's this whole Nakamoto Consensus idea, which kind of was just the founding principle, or one of the founding principles of Bitcoin, and therefore all of cryptocurrency, was that miners vote, miners decide. That's how you get network consensus, not just get all the rules on the same thing, but like if a developer proposes a change that is controversial, then you'll see which miners decide to mine on it, which don't, and at a certain point, they all have to come to consensus, or otherwise there's a split and there's competing visions or whatever. But it's basically miners or this voting mechanism. And then we had the incident of 2016, 2017 of the block reward, the block size wars. And I remember watching miner signaling, because there was an ability for miners to essentially signal something that they supported or not by hash rate. And there was a few different clients. Was it Bitcoin XT, Bitcoin Classic, a bunch of other ones. I don't remember. That was back in the day. It was a long time ago. But then you saw miner signaling of like, do you want to make a bigger block or a smaller block? Do you want to keep it the same or want a bigger block? And then at some point, the big block thing got in the high 50s, I believe, 50%. So it was a majority rule decision. And so at that point, by these, Bitcoin Unlimited, thanks, Great Wolf, as when you have basically the miners voted, and for the most part, they tended to vote, they voted for a bigger block. And then at some point there came along the Segwit2x Compromise thing that some people came out with. Hey, let's get the block size increase, and let's get Segwit, the two kind of opposite sides. Let's give everyone what they want. And within like pretty much overnight, like the Segwit approval was like almost 100. Like all the miners just got on board and actually implemented segregated witness into the Bitcoin network. But then the block size increase just never happened. So the miners clearly voted for what they wanted, I guess, kind of. But then they just never, when push came to shove, they just were not able to vote according to the way they voted. And then
they didn't get what they wanted, right? I think that they genuinely did want 2 megabyte blocks at the time, but it was a bait and switch. They were baited by Segwit, or by the 2 megabyte blocks, and then they switched it out of it. So, and that was, the developers decided not to actually implement that.
Yeah.
So this is an example of the bad incentives that it creates when the developers aren't funded by the stakeholders of a network.
Ooh, you're muted, I think, Hill.
Yeah, you're muted, Hill.
You want to unmute yourself? All right, let me see if I can figure that stuff out. But in the meantime, who muted you? I think you have to unmute yourself, but whatever.
Oh,
There we go.
can
There
you
we
hear
go.
me?
There we go. I can hear you now. Yeah,
My
go
bad.
ahead.
Yeah, so I would say the core devs have, they took over in BTC basically, and they could do that because miners are inherently passive at all times.
Yeah, that was what we learned.
Yeah, and the only times you've seen miners become bad actors in situations like Ethereum Classic, where it was really easy. There was such a low difficulty that somebody can come in and just start messing around with their network. But if a proper governance system just didn't ever exist.
Yeah. And that's one thing I think we figured out as time went on is that miners are essentially they tend to be passive actors. And of course, this is slightly different between chains. Like I would say in Dash, miners are extremely passive actors. But even in, BTC, they're probably passive too because, they voted for a bigger block kind of. But then the core devs did not put that out and they just did not run the software. And then some people, decided to create Bitcoin Cash, which did have bigger blocks and stuff. And you had some hash rate, but largely people didn't say, I'm voting for this one because this is the one that I believe. No, they voted for whatever's the most profitable chain. And then they jumped back and forth. And then there's Bitcoin SV. All right, when that's profitable, we'll mine that too. And it just ended up being that miners are passive mercenaries. Neither of which is a bad thing. Let's be perfectly clear. It's not a criticism. They work for money. They're contractors. They mine on whatever chain they want to. They'll give them profit, and they invest their equipment, whatever, in accordingly. And if something gives more profit, they go for that. It's just very and holders.
And it's dollar denominated profit usually because their equipment's usually purchased with dollars and their expenses are denominated in dollars until utility companies start accepting cryptocurrency for payment.
Yeah.
Dollar denominated profits.
And so
go ahead, Joel.
We saw with Dash when Dash included, let's do this masternode system where we get to vote. We get to vote with the stakeholders because that's one thing is obviously if you have your hardware like a 2 SHA-256 or X11 or whatever, you're kind of pigeonholed in what you could do with it. But if there's multiple SHA-256 chains, then it just mine whatever is profitable. Whereas if you have Bitcoin Cash, Bitcoin SV, and BTC, you can't just be like, I'm going to switch all my stash to the other one tomorrow because it's more profitable. It just doesn't work that way. And so we found with the Dash system where stakeholders, I still don't think that Dash stakeholders are as governance focused as they should be. There's too few participating, in my personal opinion, but that's a completely separate topic. Basically, they're much more active in governance than miners. I don't hear from miners ever in Dash. I rarely hear from miners in probably the most miner-centric coin right now, Bitcoin Cash, where you sometimes hear, there's this pool is signaling support for this, but it's very wishy-washy, very not very active. So Dash seems to have figured out something that works as far as active governance participation, and there have not been any chain splits from Dash. The Dash has remained a united currency from back in the day to now, and with no looming threats on the horizon, no big, it worked according to what else did it work for is a different discussion. But as far as governance, as far as decision making, it worked. Now we get to the whole. Well, miners can't decide things. So should we turn miners into a more passive actor that they've sort of shown that they largely want to be and just say, look, your prices won't go up and down with the treasury proposals. You're just going to be constant. You're going to do your thing. You're going to mine on the chain. It's going to work out. It's going to be fine. And then masternodes who are actually active in governance, it's okay, let's make you more active in governance. Now you see the money that you're putting into all these proposals. You see it more actively, and more importantly, you collectively field all the costs of the proposals. And that's kind of the next step. The next phase of that is, is that a good idea? Do we want to have miners still pay for their fair share of stuff that can benefit them, or do we want to just have them as kind of passive contractors? and or more importantly, if they don't, basically like, where does this go? So I would really love to hear from some of you guys in the live chat, or especially live super chat, because it brings me the duffs. But while you guys are considering your things, Hill, do you have any thoughts on that whole idea and like which is on that whole subject?
Yeah. So nobody says that you should spend, if you have for your personal expenses or for a business, you take 100% of your expenses and put in security like Bitcoin does. So it's extremely unusual outside of the crypto world with the proof of work. So you're going to spend money on your own security for locks, safety deposits or safes or whatever. So it's just a portion of it, and to elevate them to a status of being the only expense. In fact, it should be an exercise of how low can you pay before it's an actual issue, which is a difficult one to answer. It's like what's the lowest that you could pay and get security? That's how any business would run.
Of course.
For the amount of protection you get, right? So it's not just pay us low, but if you pay this low, how much protection do you get? And I think that's the goal. If you involve them beyond that, I think it's more tricky. Comes like another system that's been created. So
yeah, here's another thing to keep in mind with this whole thing. And when you have a group of, let's just say the masternodes pay for everything and they make all the decisions. Let's take that situation where all the treasury proposals come back on them exclusively. Now, does that make masternodes exclude some things that would be a net benefit for the network because the benefit to them is not big enough or, is not great enough to kind of justify things? So for example, let's just say let's just say something provides a certain amount of benefit, and under a 60-40, 60% masternodes, 40% miners end up footing the bill for a proposal. Under that thing, it makes sense. It provides more value than it costs to everyone involved. But then under a purely masternode based, only masternodes are paying, it provides enough benefit to be worth, as in Dash as a whole benefits more than Dash as a whole, pays. But since only masternodes are paying, they might decide, yeah, you know what, it's not worth it for me personally or us collectively. So even though it would make all of us better off, we're going to be gun shy about that. So do you think that could be a possibility that could come out of this sort of a situation? And if so, is that a good thing or a bad thing?
I would say let's maybe back up for a minute and answer the question: what is the purpose of mining in the first place? And Hilawe mentioned it, and it's something that I would agree with, that the purpose of mining is security. And I think originally, Satoshi originally probably had in mind that mining would be a way to evenly and fairly distribute the coins. We all know that that's kind of not the case anymore, and that it's incredibly hard to have a profitable mining operation. So having coin distribution,
relatively,
it's no longer serving the purpose of a fair and distributed coin distribution system. So it's left with now basically securing the network, and doing that is essentially providing a random enough, it's providing enough entropy, as nerds like to call it, but it's basically, a provably random number that can be relied on in order to base the permission to write blocks to the blockchain. That's essentially what it is. So as long as they're getting paid well enough to do that system and that function effectively, that's as much as we need to be paying them. Now that might be 90%, that might be 80%, that might be 40%. It's a very difficult question to answer, but it's certainly not 100%. We already have decided that, and it may be less than what we're paying them now. There's no reason that 45% should be or is or ever was a magic number that's exactly right. And so the question is kind of a subjective question about how much security do we need. It's a technical question also, but it's also a subjective question that the stakeholders should be most interested in answering. And you can source that out to the professionals, obviously, but it's a decision that should be probably made by the masternode owners in collaboration with the technical teams that we employ.
Yeah, and now to add another spin on that whole thing about how much are you paying, how much security do you want? There's an extra nuance in Dash in the last year or 2 years about, which is how much security do you need from that avenue? Now, most of Dash's history and most of any proof of work coin's history, it's been all miners. Everything's been miners. Just that's where you get all your security. If you get a 51% attack, you're destroyed. So it's over. People can steal your stuff. But then Dash implemented a thing called chain locks, which used masternodes as a second layer of security to basically make the first scene block permanent. And it's basically much, much more expensive and difficult to go in and attack the network from a chain locks perspective than it is a mining perspective. I mean, you could theoretically buy a bunch of mining hardware, rent a bunch of hash rate or whatever you do, and attack Dash from the mining standpoint for much, much cheaper than to attack it from the masternode standpoint, which would require, purchasing tons and tons of Dash and pumping the price to the moon in the process and stuff like that. So now it's not just like how much security do we need. The answer with pretty much every proof of work coin is as much as we can get, right? That's kind of where it is. Whereas with Dash, it's how much security do you want from mining, and that's much more subjective. And my initial opinion, again, I haven't really thought through this too much, but my initial opinion would be enough security so that if for some reason something happens to the masternode networks, like too many of them are running on Amazon AWS, and then that gets taken off for like a week, and people are scrambling to figure out how to point their nodes to something else, or whatever happens, or there's a bug or something, that you can't just like run to like rentahash.com and just instantly for like 20 grand just destroy the whole network. It's got to be difficult enough that it works as a backup. But then miners are not only entropy providers, but they're a secondary source of security where they were used to be the only source of security.
Yeah, that's an important point to make, that miners, while it may be their exclusive job to provide security, it's not exclusively miners that do provide security. In fact, like you just mentioned, masternodes are also providing security, and adoption is also a form of security. If you ask Roger Ver, that's what he'll tell you.
Yeah,
that
for sure.
the best form of security against certain attacks is a high user base that has a very functional utility-based. You have users who love the product and would therefore really be up in arms if a state-level actor, for example, tried to shut it down. That's a form of security that's probably more important than 51% attack security in some respects.
Yeah.
So every dollar, dash or duff that we spend on mining security is a dash that we can't spend on masternode or user security, adoption security. And adoption security comes from the proposal system. So that's why there's this intimate interplay between miners, masternodes, and the proposal system, because they're all providing security.
Yeah. Let me throw in something that Dationalist said in the live chat. Says that MNOs are the ultimate beneficiaries of increasing wealth of the network. They suffer the most financially of bad decisions and benefit the most off of good decisions. And that kind of, when you think about paying miners, the costs that basically what are we paying for? It's not just like what does the network receive, but if you pay a masternode owner, They have 1,000 Dash, and then they get more Dash. They choose to use, to live on, to fund to a much lesser extent, fund servers and stuff like that to actually run the node itself. It's now miners. Mostly what that does is it goes to compensate for equipment cost. So people are creating and building ASICs and stuff for Dash. That is to a certain extent a certain benefit, but most of what you're paying for is electricity. So it's just that a lot of Dash traded for electricity is kind of it. And so if you're thinking about like a user-based type of thing, if like the whole world is mining Dash, then it's just the whole world is trading it for electricity or something. And I don't know that that has a higher chance of making power companies take Dash maybe for payment, but other than that, it's not really an adoption multiplier. But if everyone has as a masternode or a piece of a masternode is getting some, whatever they're going to do with it is at least going to be, could just be fiat on ramps and just switching it, but it also could be buying stuff. So, and that kind of brings me to another thing. So when we're talking about miners providing a kind of like, rather than like the kings of the network being as contractors for a secondary security mechanism now that Chainlocks is around, but then you go to if you're trying to put a minimized role for miners, but they still have a huge effect of power, a huge veto power on the whole network. And is that a problem where you have someone who is a minor actor who still has this potential kill switch on the whole network in a certain extent? So what do you think about that concept?
So, first of all, if a miner buys an A6 X11, they're just really only doing it for Dash. Yesterday, I was looking at the next available X11 coin.
Which one is it now?
EDC.
Oh, yeah, that was like nothing.
Oh, yeah, it's like ranked 701. Has a market cap of a few million. So basically, if you're going to buy that equipment, it's just for Dash. And something else about the miners, if the prices spike really fast, they're going to sell because they're going to want to renew their rigs. They have competition coming at that point. So their incentive is not necessarily to hold as much as masternode owners would be. And we've always known that, but that's why you have to find the least amount that you can give them without them having any issues and falling out. So what can they do? I don't know if you're really asking this, but they could potentially, for a loss, maybe buy up all the hash rate. They can affect the quorum selection. They could interfere with that.
They can do nothing. That's one of the biggest risks is that they do nothing and they don't adopt the proposed changes, and or they specifically want to adopt one set of changes over another set of changes, creating a coin fork. Those are the risks, but I don't think that those risks are very high. Of first of all, them doing that, or secondly, having any success trying to do that, because the economic majority is what really matters here. What's going to happen if there ends up being a split, a network split, and there are two, there's Dash and Dash Classic, for example. Well, if all the masternode owners voted for Dash, and there's a large contingency of old school Dash miners that want to continue with Dash Classic, well, all those masternode owners are now masternode owners on both splits, on both sides of the split. And what are they going to do? They're going to sell the other coin into the ground, basically, annihilating the value of that whole chain. And they're going to sell it for Dash on the other chain. So, it's possible that they can split it, but I think they know this as well as we all do. And they're going to follow the economic majority and what the masternodes decide because of that.
I agree. If they don't update, it's usually because they just they don't know about it.
Of course.
And now we've had 10 plus years of a record to show how passive they are.
Now, there's another wrinkle to this whole thing, which is sure they're passive because they don't see the effects of proposals at all, and they don't see the effects of things. They just whatever brings them profit, it works.
Yeah.
Now, there's another speculation that what if they start having to see their own money fluctuate based on what the Treasury does. Well, then they become much more active and then possibly upgrade quicker or things like that. Now, that's another thing to kind of think about. And we're starting running out of time here, but the entire purpose of this entire thing was let's just get talking about this because we, as far as, Bitcoin is a very originalist sort of, for lack of a better term, scripture-based kind of a project where there's the holy white paper, and part of Bitcoin's allure is its inability to really change that much. It's basically going to be as constant as possible in this, highly changing technological world. And Dash decided to take a different approach, which is let's take everything that Bitcoin did well and let's just make improvements wherever we can. Nothing too radical, but just like safe, efficient, well-researched little improvements. And so far, I think it's done fantastic for Dash. And so when we're talking about this kind of, we're talking about revisiting everything kind of. And so I think it's important to have these kinds of questions out there, these kind of discussions to just, just like we say, oh, the Treasury, it works fine. It's been great. And then, oh, wait. It's been mostly great, but there's some things we might be able to make it even greater by introducing some actual economic incentives into the decision-making process, make it a little bit more obvious. And so then we're thinking about, well, does it have to be 60-40? Does the Treasury part have to be 60-40 for masternode miners? And that's another thing that I think that, because it's such a radical departure, everything that Dash is doing is a one more radical departure between the tried and true, the proven Bitcoin model, which it's proven to be effective to a certain extent. Like it's a constant. Whether you think it's good or bad, it's a constant. We know. We don't yet know exactly what could happen with continuing changes with Dash, and that's why I think we need to get as much of the brain space of the Dash community thinking about this as possible to just sort of see what comes out of it. Yeah. So thanks so much for coming on, guys. Now it's going to be, obviously this stream live. I'm going to share it all out tomorrow. It's going to be on the audio only podcast stuff on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever the hell else. And now guess what? It's time for this thing called the after party, which is just like this, except more casual. It's not filmed, don't worry. And the way you do that, you go to the Dash Talk Discord, which, as I'm about to type into this live chat right now, is staydashy.com. You go in there, you start asking around for the after party, and then someone should plug you in. And then I have a feeling that the after party is going to be full of passionate debate on this kind of a subject today. So that's where to go. Any final thoughts, gentlemen?
I would just say that this conversation, it may have seemed a little bit, out of context, but we're going to see in the next month or so some very important decisions to make. So I think it's good that we've got this conversation at least started now, if it hasn't already started before now, because there are some important decisions to make, and there's going to be a lot of discussion that has to happen because they're going to be, it's going to shape the future of Dash for the next 5+ years.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And also remember that there's other economic changes that could occur in the future in terms of what threshold it would take to pass masternode for proposals, how they pass, escrow changes, delegation. So I would just encourage everybody to keep track of it and to just show more interest if possible.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Well,
and I look forward to the after party.
Yep, hope to see some of you guys over there. Bye, everyone.
All right.